Here's a Victron Air, what is this called? It's not an Air King, it's an Air Flight hassock fan. And I've got this disassembled because the power cord insulation is getting really brittle. It did work, but I didn't think it was very safe with bad insulation. So I've got all the components disassembled. Here's the housing. And we don't want this to fall apart because each of these little deflector rings are separate. And someone did a little bit of a repair job there with some copper wire. I got the blades off. This is probably a Torrington. Yes, it is Torrington. And here's the speed control switch, and the auto transformer is down in the base of this little housing here. Here's the Victron motor. And I think I'm going to have to try and put this in a vise to try and pull this back part off. I need to get the rear part of the motor housing off so I can replace the cable. So I'm going to take this down to the retro electronics shop and wrap this with a rag and put it in the vise and see if I can somehow pull this off, because I wasn't able to just pull it apart with my hands. Here's the knob. And then the motor mounts on this Bakelite base here, which I need to be real careful not to crack. So here's all these components. So the next thing I'm going to do is to replace all of this old wiring on it. Now I've got the motor in the vise. So at first I tried a method that was unsuccessful, and it kind of dinged up the bearing housing here. I even put a cloth on this, but I put vice grips on this and just sort of tried to see if I could pull on it any, and that didn't do it. But I think I found a method that worked. I very carefully got a very fine screwdriver and just sort of used a hammer and just tapped it gently down in this groove between the two sections. And then I've used larger and larger screwdrivers and just sort of turned it to try to separate the two halves. Now maybe I should have asked about this if there was anyone who had any more experience with these as far as how to disassemble them, but I couldn't really see any other way to get into it. So I'm just going to get some larger screwdrivers and just sort of widen up this gap, and then hopefully I'll be able to pull this rear shell off of the motor. Now we've got the rear housing of the motor off. I had to use a screwdriver and a hammer and just sort of tap at it to get it off. And so now here's the rear bearing. It's a really good deep bearing. And here's the power cord. It looks like it's got rubber wiring right into the core. So I'll first try and heat this rubber wiring up with heat shrink or with a heat gun very carefully so as not to melt it. And then we'll run the heat shrink tubing over the rubber insulated wires as far into the core as possible. I use the heat gun to slightly soften these rubber wires so I could get the knot untied, and now I'm going to put the heat shrink tubing on. Now I've got the tubing in about as far as it'll go, so I'm going to use the heat gun. Now I've got the motor reassembled. I had to cheat a little bit and run each of these leads out through a separate hole because I couldn't get them both through the original hole with the heat shrink tubing on there. And I put a little bit of extra right where the wires go through the hole. I've got the test cord hooked up here so we can check the performance. So let's check it out here. And it runs very smoothly. Well, the shaft was still spinning there. And I took the mallet here, pounded the back end on here, and I left it open a little bit. I didn't pound it all the way in case I need to get back into it again. It'll be a lot easier the next time. I don't know why they had to make this motor like this. It makes it a lot more difficult to disassemble. But I think this heat shrink tubing should provide better insulation than the old rubber wire. So now I can take this back to my workshop, and we can splice on new power cord and new cords to the variable speed transformer.